Wait for YouTube to kick in, do its thing. It's connecting. And we are live on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, episode 83 of Thompson and Other Disappointments. My guest this afternoon is a grassroots political strategist with a toe in lobbying and tactical voting initiatives. We got talking at Byline Festival last week, and I thought he had some really interesting ideas about where we're at now on the left and where those of us on the left of the political landscape can expect to be if we play our cards right, and indeed what those cards might be. Please welcome to the show my guest this afternoon, Josh Russell. Woo!
Hi.
Hi.
How you doing?
I
Thanks for the
am
intro.
great. How are you doing?
Not bad. A little bit chilly where I am, but
Are you? I'm fucking roasting, mate. I've got the sun coming in here. I've got, I feel a little bit greenhoused.
yeah, no, I sit in a little cupboard, so it's a bit different.
Yeah. Thanks very much for taking time out of your, no doubt, very busy schedule this afternoon. I guess a good place to start, Josh, would be to give people a bit of background about what you do and how you came to do it, like what your background is.
Yeah, so my background is mainly technology, but always with a kind of campaigning or political kind of side to it. I've worked in some big charities. I've worked in some big tech companies as well, and done my own little projects along the way of both kinds of tech startups, mini campaigns. But I suppose one of the most formative things in my kind of like campaigning career was working at Comic Relief, in what was a very small digital team at the time, where we were running, the donations platform for Red Nose Day and stuff like that. But we were also tasked with basically operating the Make Poverty History campaign, and the Live 8 concert that went along with that. And that was, this huge campaign
Yeah.
where a lot of us learned a lot very quickly, because we had literally a matter of weeks to put it all together.
So sort of like progressive tech with a conscience.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, kind of counter to a lot of the way a lot of people think about tech, I guess.
Sure.
That's a big conversation.
Sure. And so then at some point you've made the move from that kind of like charity sector into sort of like left-leaning politics, full blown, right?
Yeah, I mean, left, unsure, progressive, yes, I think. Labels don't help sometimes. But yeah, so most recently been working on kind of Brexit-related things, so helping people understand Brexit, fighting different bits of Brexit. Every time something Brexit happens, there was another fight to be had.
Yeah.
And it all came down to Article 50, I guess. But yeah, that's been the last 3 or 4 years, or 5 or 6 years. And then more recently, getting into like, okay, what's the root of all this stuff? What's the cause? What do we really need to do? And I think ultimately a lot of it comes down to a change of government at this point.
Sure, sure. And so let's sort of stay in terms of your like your background and working in that sort of Brexit space. Can you give us an example of some of the like projects that you've worked on? Were they sort of like raising awareness or kind of gathering votes in Parliament or?
Yeah, so it kind of actually took the form of a large community of people trying to do all sorts of little projects together, really, and helping each other out. So we have about 400 or so kind of technology design people, some marketers, some copywriters, basically all in Slack or other channels, thinking up ideas. And so I was really a facilitator in that, although was built a few things myself. One of the most prominent things that came out of all that was a website called My EU,
Okay.
myeu.uk, and it was basically a map of where EU spending had been around you. So you could put your postcode in
Yeah.
and like go, oh, that club around the corner got 50 grand last year, or my park got refurbished from EU funding, and it really helped because like so much of what the EU does is kind of invisible, but it's all around you as well. And so there was a really good little platform that helped kind of tell those really local stories. And it turns out pretty much everywhere in the UK has been, seen the benefit directly, really directly, but it's just not talked about.
Yeah, that was one of the sort of takeaways from Carol Codwalla's what's it called? A TED Talk,
Hmm.
where she was talking about her hometown in Wales and how much money the EU had put into this town, the local facilities, and yet nobody
Yeah.
knew where the money was coming from or how much the EU had done for that
Yeah.
town. But they had all, not all, but a majority had voted to then leave the European Union, even though
Mm.
they'd benefited from it. And I remember thinking around that time when I first watched that, I don't really remember an awful lot of promotion, like kind of PR stuff coming from the EU around the Brexit referendum. Perhaps there was an element of complacency to it. Do you think there's a lesson to be learned there that we need to be a little bit more PR savvy? And
I mean, telling stories is important, and uh, a personal local story is really powerful. And I think, when you hear those, it really hits you hard and it's emotional. And so many of us can relate, to the personal stories that other people are going through. And it really does unify us, right, across the country, across all sorts of different, groups of people. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it would have been appropriate for the EU to get involved in telling those stories,
mm,
but there was certainly a lot of collateral that could be used, like the data that we had for the EU spending, locked up in spreadsheets, right?
yeah,
Really unuseful medium. Putting on a map just really helped. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look back the last 40 years, we were just really terrible at telling the story of the EU, really,
I suppose it's difficult to battle against. Like, what's that stat where it's like if somebody tells you a bad story or a scary thing that happened to them,
Mm,
like they're more likely to tell, is it like 5 or 7 people about that?
right.
But a good story, they'll like maybe tell 1 or 2 other people. Like, oh, guess what happened today? Yeah, I fucking found a quid on the floor. Oh, well, that's amazing. I can't wait for the movie. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
it's like not as interesting, but I nearly got hit by a bus today. That's fucking wow. Tell me everything.
you just have to look at the news to kind of see that bias, right? So the
Yeah.
headline is always some big disaster somewhere or something, really controversial, and then the puppy stories are right at the end, aren't they?
Yeah.
What if we heard all the good stuff, kind of with equal pegging, right?
Well, it goes back to our brains, doesn't it? We're problem solvers. We look for problems. That's why we spend so much time bitching and moaning.
Yeah.
Uh, but there's definitely, there's a question to be raised there that if you are the EU, and it's in your interest to remind people of the success stories and the benefits that they have as a result of being part of that family, if you like, if that's not too
Yeah.
fluffy a cuddly word for it. How come they then why would it not be appropriate for them to communicate that stuff back to the UK public, but it is appropriate for, let's say, Vote Leave to say we should fucking leave because like Turkish people look.
Yeah. I mean, in my head, I can imagine that if the EU got involved too much in our democratic process,
Mm,
right, that would be called out, and possibly rightly so.
mm,
But there are very neutral ways of telling good stories about why the EU is important to every member, not just the UK.
mm.
And we're seeing it now. I think from the outside, where there is positive stuff to unity, and of course we're missing out. I mean, you don't even need to talk about crossing borders as being an issue to understand why being a group of other countries is important. Yeah, but I think one of the major things was that we were also not very good at admitting its faults as well, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, all sorts of angles to it, and I think people will obviously be talking about this for a long time. I think one of the ironies of Brexit was that it was actually the beginning rather than the end of all of that.
Mm.
People who are sick and tired of hearing about the EU kind of triggered the beginning of hearing about the EU for the next 40 years, while we basically start from scratch again.
Yeah,
Every single thing we do is a step closer to rejoining the EU right now.
yeah.
And it wasn't Remainers who triggered that.
No, no, and it's also it was a sort of like crossing a bell curve of like, so I imagine it on the left hand side of the bell curve, it's sort of almost imaginary problems of like perceived immigration issues where or like a fear of, let's say, multiculturalism, like to a large extent fantasy problems. And then once you get up over the bell curve, you go down. Now we're in this realm of real problems of like trade, logistics, Northern Ireland Protocol, possible civil unrest. Like we've kind of swapped the the luxury of having fantasy problems for jumping into this new world of like, oh fuck, what's going to happen if I don't get my medication in? Or,
Yeah.
should we book a holiday to Belfast next year? I don't know.
But that was all hyperbole, wasn't it, originally? I remember insulin and various cancer drugs were, at risk through various import reasons,
Mm,
and not because they wouldn't be able to come in, but because they would be taking too long to come in, and therefore, because they go off, would have issues. And then, yeah, I mean, simply going on holiday, right? People thought, oh no, I'll just pay the £7 visa and it'll be fine, right?
mm,
It's like, well, first of all, if there's a family of you, it's going to cost more. Secondly, your money's going to be worth less. It's really hard to explain why, but it is. And so just being in a different country is going to cost you more than it used to.
mm.
I mean, one of the other projects we made was can I move to Barcelona.com?
Right.
And I think it's probably down now. But the idea was that, of course, yes, right now you can, but here's going to be the issues and why it might be harder later. And I think, there was this kind of there's obviously absolutism, in how we think about a lot of things, unfortunately. And the absolutism there was like, but you are still going to be able to move to Barcelona. So what's your problem? It's
Yeah.
like, well, yeah, but the level at which it's going to be easy or hard is the issue,
Mm,
And you're just saying, but we are still going to be able to do it. It's like, yeah, we are still going to be able to do it, but why make it harder for ourselves?
yeah. Like, and what's the net benefit of it? Like, what are you getting
Yeah.
in return? Yeah.
I mean, we're waiting for those, aren't we? I mean, we have a minister for it and a department for it. Um,
Who seems to have so much time on his hands that he spends it walking around pinning post-it notes to their desks.
Yeah, there was some irony in that, wasn't there? It's like, he was expecting people to be at, that doing work meant being at your desk while he was not at his desk, presumably doing his work.
Yeah.
Their self-awareness well, the lack of self-awareness is mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's sort of move on a little bit from Brexit, because I don't want to get,
Yes,
you know,
please.
attacked too much by frothing Brexiters. So you worked a lot on sort of digital products around Brexit,
Mm.
around raising awareness and so on. But then more recently, you've moved into like kind of tactical voting kind of spaces, or what are you doing now?
Yeah. So as well as the Brexit work, we've been working on, democracy as a whole, right? It's clearly quite a busy space. There's lots of organisations working on either improving democracy, think tanks and other organisations, just who've been doing this for a very long time. You've got much more kind of hands-on organisations where they're trying to like raise engagement,
Mm,
get people to be part of democracy more, and then look at the reasons that people aren't or mechanisms that are in the way. But also, of course, democracy is a tool we can use for change. Arguably, it's the biggest one we have. When democracy is about controlling the biggest budgets on the planet, right?
hmm.
But these organisations that have responsibility for more people's lives than any other organisations, and we have a chance to choose who runs them and what they do with their money,
Yeah.
right? And I think any problem you're trying to solve ultimately comes down to who's in charge, and the biggest who's in charge is your government, right?
Sure.
And so if you really want to affect change, that's where you start, I think. And it's the difference between what I say. You're either banging on the door trying to ask people for change, or taking a seat at the table, right, and
Mm.
making those changes happen. And I think a lot of us are spending a lot of energy banging on the door at the moment. But if you focus on actually trying to take a seat, then maybe we don't need to bang on the door anymore. Yeah.
And so, where would you grade British democracy and people's ability to affect change right now? Where do you think we're at?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I mean, I honestly do think we're not one of the worst, obviously, right? There's an election going on in the Philippines right now, right? And that's a pretty bad place when it comes to like the quality of a democracy.
Hmm.
However, the way that our democracy is set up to work, even though it is just about still a democracy, is one that isn't very representative. And I was trying to think the other day, like who is represented in government, and it's really fascinating to think like go through the list. Like we obviously know that people that don't vote are technically not represented,
Mm.
and there's like 15 million people who register to vote and then don't show up, so they're not represented. There are a lot of people that sit in safe seats. A safe seat is where your vote won't really affect the outcome. So there's millions of people there that aren't represented as well because the person they vote for or the party they vote for, or the policies they vote for, don't end up being in government or even having a voice, in government. Then you've got people that voted for opposition, current opposition parties who win, but they don't really have any say in parliament because of the way that our majority government works. And
Yeah.
so even those people who did show up, voted for an opposition party, won the seat, but now don't really have any power. Well, they're not represented either.
Can you
So
give an
like, who is?
example of that? Because it's, I suppose, from my mind, possibly quite ignorant mind, I sort of imagine, right, okay, so you've got the Tories who are in power, then you've got Labour, who were reasonably crushed by the Tories' 80-seat majority, then you've got the Liberal Democrats, and then you've got some other smaller parties who won seats, but because of the size of the seats that they won, they are then prohibited or frustrated in terms of how much time they get to spend in the House of Commons debating, or how does it work?
I suppose it depends how much you think debating has an effect. And I think when you've got an 80-seat majority, that debate doesn't have as much effect as you might think. In a close call parliament, where you've got a handful of seats as a majority, your debate might change the minds of a few of the MPs sitting on the other side of the table. But even when you change a few minds in this case, you've still got 50 people that are just going to do what the whip says. So I think it depends how much you think debate is effectual in that case. I think it obviously does have an effect, but not to the level that it traditionally has. And I think this particular government has shown us that, petitioning them, protesting them, debating them, highlighting facts to them, makes no difference at all.
Yeah.
They have an agenda, and they're on it, and that's what they're doing.
That's a really interesting point to make, because I suppose, like a lot of people, when I was chatting with Marina Purkis a few weeks ago, I asked when she got into politics, and she said the Brexit referendum, and I was like, me too. It was, as far as I'm concerned, like I kind of hold my hands up. I'm like, I was radicalized by that referendum. But I'm also sort of acutely aware that maybe politics wasn't always this bad, but it seems to me that when I watch parliamentary debates, or when I go searching or researching for videos or something, and I'm trying to see what people say in the House of Commons when they're discussing, for example, the Internal Markets Bill a couple of years ago, what the responses were, was it actually a debate? I come away with this perception that it's all pantomime. It's just this guy stands up and says, but have you considered X, Y, and Z? Then the Tory stands up and says the thing that was debunked fucking like 6 days ago. So it's like, there's no actual meaningful transaction and reaching a consensus. It's, as you've just said a minute ago, it's what the whip has said. It's like, you will fucking support this. I mean, was it always this bad?
I would say it's even worse than that at the moment, in that it's essentially all scripted, right? And I don't mean that they literally sit down and write a script together, but they all have they know what's going to come up. They know what questions are coming. They've already written answers to them. It's not really debate. They're performing debate, at that point. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of other places within government and parliament where proper debate does go on. There's committees as well, of course, and all sorts of other places. But yeah, it is performative. Pantomime. Yeah, in some cases, certainly some of them treat it like that. And I just can't imagine what it's like being someone sensible in that room. It just must be so frustrating. Like, why would you even show up some of the time?
Yeah.
So even those people, I think, are using it as a way to get their soundbite heard, that they can then go and use it on their own campaigning. And I get that. I completely get that, so they need to be able to say, look, I stood in Parliament and I said a thing on your behalf, and this is what I said, but even that is kind of like, well, if you're just saying things to make sure you get elected next time, without addressing the real issue of why what you're saying isn't being heard, and why you being there doesn't have an effect on the outcomes, then why are any of us really there? And I think, that then starts to talk about, how that is potentially a strategic thing happening, right? We are being basically taught that this doesn't matter. And of course, like I said earlier, it's the only thing that really does.
Yeah.
And this touches, then on, well, they're all the same, aren't they? And they're clearly not. They're clearly not all the same.
Yeah. Do you think they are all as cynical and careerist as they come off? Because like I look at them standing up there on the benches, reciting the line that they've been given or that they've given themselves like 10, 15 times before. And as I've said, it's already been debunked 10 or 15 times, but there they are again, wheeling it out. Or do you think, like, is it just the pressure of the parliamentary system that they know they've got to say what they then say to survive and to not be deselected or to not fall foul of the parliamentary party?
It's probably a combination of habit and pressure. The habit is that it's routine. This is how it works. You go and you do your thing.
Yeah.
And you do things as you're expected to. And we kind of know that someone saying something very moral against something awful that the government is doing isn't going to have any effect. But we're glad that they said it. And it's like, okay, there are some good people, but again, we don't address that those good people don't really get to affect much.
Yeah.
So having a good voice is important, but it needs to take that one step further. And I think the same thing can be said about the petitions and protests as well. They are super important in the sense that we know that there are other people out there that believe the same things we do, right? We can go on a march and there's camaraderie, and it's like, okay, I'm not alone, and that's important. But we have to stop thinking it has a natural effect when you have a government that doesn't listen.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, and this isn't just with the current government, of course. We had some of the biggest marches ever against the Iraq War, and that wasn't the Conservative government. But then you go back even further. I mean, C&D protests back in the day, right? We've got more nukes than we've ever had.
Yeah.
What effect did that have, right? So it's that you need to not only say this is bad, but you need to then take part in the things that change our ways of affecting those bad things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was going to say, like, maybe it's important to look at these things as not the actual mechanism for change. So like a protest is in itself is not going to change anything. You mentioned the Iraq War protests. I think from memory, that was 1 million people marching against it. And still on it went. But the protests, the petitions and so on all serve as little components to a gradually optimizing machine that eventually does kick out people from power, right?
Yeah, they're movement building, and like I say, it's about not feeling alone, and I think that is super important because part of campaigning for things you care about is that often it's quite demoralizing, because you very rarely have wins, and while it can feel good to be part of something, when ultimately you don't get what you wanted out of it, it's really awful. We've all been there. We've all probably got personal stories about times where we really fought hard for something, kind of knew that it wouldn't really happen, and then it doesn't, and you're like, well, why would I bother?
Yeah.
And it must cross so many campaigners' minds, like, why am I bothering? What's this all for? And so I think movement building is super important because then you can go next time and it gets bigger and there are more people understanding something, and the details are becoming more coherent about what it is that we're fighting for. Leaders emerge from these communities and groups, right, who dedicate more of their time and are able to achieve more by just articulating something in a better way, for example, right, or playing a good PR game and getting on TV. But ultimately, there needs to be calls to action as well, and a call to action is not sign a petition, right? That's a step along the way. Calls to action need to be big and tangible, and actually things that affect change. I mean, going back to my time at Comic Relief, and I called out C&D earlier. We Make Poverty History. We had something like 40 million signatures on a petition, right? I don't know of a petition that's ever been that big. For the Live 8 concerts, we had globally 2.3 billion people watch those concerts, right? The biggest thing I've ever seen. There's World Cups and Olympics that might come close, but in a 24-hour period, 2.3 billion. But there was a flaw, right? And not only did that large number of people say, we really hate poverty. In Comic Relief at the time, their catchphrase was "Pants to Poverty," which I thought was quite a good one.
Yeah.
They were selling pants instead of noses for once.
Cool.
So you got all these people saying this is awful, but ultimately, what it was us taking these signatures to 8 of the most powerful men in the world, the G8 in Scotland, and saying, please do something. Look how many people want you to do it.
Yeah.
And they didn't. And so the risk in asking people to do things they don't want to do is really obvious. They
Yeah.
might not do them. And so you put all that energy in and you didn't get anything you want back from it, you know?
But
So
then,
a real call to action has to actually be direct change, I think.
yeah. But then, like, is there an argument there that with the Live 8 signatures or the Make Poverty History signatures, that they served as a component that then in a broader space will affect change? Like, have we seen any reduction in poverty in that time? Did it serve as like the prelude to anything, or?
I mean, so, there has been some debt dropped from some of the poorest countries in the world, but ultimately, it's not just about that. Climate change is, of course, having a huge impact on poverty as well.
Mm-hmm.
Democracy has an impact on poverty, and we're seeing that even here, right, with more people using food banks than ever. We're a rich country, right? I think we were the fifth. We're now the sixth, possibly,
Yeah.
after Brexit. And yet we have, a huge amount of people in poverty. So it's not just about the debt, although some of the debt was dropped. But we've also got more people in slavery than we've ever had in human history right now.
Mm.
We just call it something different, right? None of these things are getting better. And again, you could look at climate campaigns. You know, the numbers are still going up,
Yeah.
right? The carbon is still going up. The temperature, projected temperature is still going up, even though huge amounts of effort, money, time, and people have been involved in trying to ask other people to do something about it.
Mm.
And that's what it all comes down to, asking others. And what I think we really need to do is, instead of having people we have to ask to do things in these positions of power, we should put people in those positions of power that want to do those things.
Yeah.
I
Which
know that's an easy thing to say out loud, but it's just so obvious.
Yeah, yeah, but it brings me nicely on to my next question. So, like we've talked a bit about trying to raise awareness, creating these petitions, lobbying. What is the next step? Like, if you set yourself the goal of I want to put somebody with progressive ideas into number 10, how would you do that?
Um, well, so the first thing I think is to address that a lot of people feel like there's no one out there with that future vision.
Mm,
And I think that's a fair critique. In politics itself, there are very few people that actually say, here's an incredible kind of like vision for the future of everybody in the country,
yeah.
right? Um, that is fair. However, I think when you look outside of politics, there are tens of thousands of people that have those visions, whether it be for their local communities, or globally, right? And not only a vision, because having a vision is easy, but also, a plan, right? And actual, implementable ideas that are being implemented, in different places or at different scales. So there are people out there that have that vision and the capability and are probably more honest, right? And more qualified and more representative as well. They're not just the Etonian, middle-aged white men that, we become used to in government. So there are those people out there. I think that's the first thing, is that it's like, okay, if they're not currently standing as an MP, fine, I get it. A lot of them are uninspiring,
Mm,
but we need to go and find other people and kind of just say, look, take the next step, right? Stand for something, and we'll elect you, right? So that's the first thing. And I think those people are out there, and movement building is important for finding those people.
yeah.
Um, I think the longer question really is that, well, the longer answer, sorry, is that, of course, the current setup is not necessarily designed to allow those people to come from nowhere and be elected. At the moment, you have to go through one of the major parties, you have to go through their processes and systems and their politics to then be selected. And then maybe you might win, right? But then, that comes with all sorts of other issues as well. If you're trying to stand as an independent, of course, there's lots of things stacked against you, because we see politics in this country, especially, as just a kind of, one party versus the other party, the footballification of it, and no one else really gets a look in. And even like, the Green Party, which is a small party, gets a lot of votes,
Mm-hmm.
comparable to the SNP. I think SNP have about 30% more, which is, not a huge amount when you're talking a million or 1.2 million votes or whatever it is. And they get one seat,
Yeah.
right? So even the smaller parties, are not going to get the representation, even though people do want them there. So the system obviously has to change, and obviously that's some form of proportional representation. I think there's so many of us that know that's the problem, right? And we know that that's the answer, and we all kind of like we know that that's what we'll support. But the trick then is, well, how do you get it? Right? How do you get PR? You know, and so the question we have at the moment is like, well, who's gonna give us PR? Whose interest is it in? You know,
Yeah.
it certainly isn't the current government. You know, they're doing very well with a minority of the vote, right? So then we have to try and convince the other parties to not only do it, well, say they'll do it, but to then do it, but to somehow win the next election based on it as well, potentially. You know, so that's a tricky one.
Is there not a risk, though, that if you tried to implement proportional representation in the UK, that the media would just fucking shoot it down? They would be like, this is radical, this is, they're trying to fix the game, they're trying to stack the deck in their own favor, and to an extent we are, right? But there are other countries that operate in this way, right?
Yeah, plenty. There's only us and Belarus in Europe that don't,
Yeah.
right? And that should tell you something. I think the media have a bias to the status quo. It's not necessarily that they have a bias against good ideas, but anything that is kind of like challenging or different, is a bit weird and a bit out there. And it's like, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea. The irony there, of course, is that our current government is doing incredibly radical things every day, and we just kind of accept it, and like one of the most frustrating things a campaigner can ever be told is that you can't change the world when you're seeing it being changed around you all the time.
Yeah.
So I think we just need to basically, not ignore the media entirely, but to call them out on that a little bit.
So that's easier said than done, though, isn't it? Because it's like, like I've never been more acutely aware than in the last 2 weeks of how much power the British newspapers have in terms of contorting, reframing, distorting messaging, and putting it into a place where, I'd like to think I'm reasonably media savvy and I can kind of, just roll my eyes at the headlines when I see them. But for every other, Tom, Dick, and Harry on the street who's not a news junkie who doesn't obsess over politics, all that's going to happen is they're going to walk past the newsstand, see the headlines on the Express and the Mail and the Sun, and they're going to take that as gospel. And even if you said to them, do you trust the newspapers to tell you the truth? They would say no, but it works. Like, it still goes into their brain.
It's a drip, drip, drip. Isn't
Yeah.
it?
And my fear is that if you started suggesting proportional representation and you tried to sort of not pay attention to the media, it's a David and Goliath fight. I think they're just, like, I'm there with you. I'm like, yes, we need proportional representation, but I think the media would just be like I would get demonized. They'd be like, look at this guy in his 3-bed home counties house, like champagne socialist, wants to upend the system, and it'd be over before it
we
started.
want to rig the system in favor of the people. That's really it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
partly we don't need to try and go into a lot of the nuance about how it would work. We just need to counter some of the really, really simple ideas. I mean, one of the most frustrating ones is, oh, but didn't we already have a vote on that? It's like, well, no, we didn't. We had a vote on a completely different system that was miscommunicated by the government at the time, misrepresented by the media at the time, which of course is your point.
Sure.
But ultimately wasn't what we're talking about right now. And I think we just need to find the right ways of reaching people in a way that they can understand it personally. And I think the obvious one is, and Keir Starmer has said this, when he in his leadership race, that people don't feel like their vote counts. And I think a lot of people also think that even if their vote counts, when, like I was saying earlier, when people get in, they're still not represented anyway. So there is this kind of like, why should I bother kind of approach. But if you ultimately want change, then you do need people in charge who care about making that change. Your vote should count, because that's how you get those people in there. And it's about talking about things on those terms, not getting stuck in the details of it. The details of it, frankly, are going to be worked out by much smarter people than me. And they are doing, and these are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been, part of democracy for a very long time, how to work out how to make a democracy the most fair.
Yeah. I suppose a key thing for me would be to take that point that you replied to me a minute ago, that like everyone else in Europe does this.
Yeah,
So why are we this, like, ask yourself,
yeah.
why are we sticking with this system when it's been deemed to be unfair and non-representative? Like, who's telling you that this is the right way to do it, and what could their reasons be for why they're marketing it to you like this?
Yeah, and also it says something about the confidence of the parties as well, right? If they don't think they could actually win under a system that was fair,
Mm,
I
yeah,
mean, like get them to say that out loud, right?
yeah,
Like, what?
yeah.
Oh, you think you can't win if we vote for you?
Well, it's also there's also another piece around it, around the word radical. So here I am, sort of, playing devil's advocate, that people would say and see it as too radical, that it was, we were trying to stack the deck and so on. But I think when you look at what, let's say, the rest of Europe or wherever else are doing, it's actually similar to what you were saying earlier. It's us that are the radical ones. Like, we've
Yeah,
put in this radical, exaggerated system to benefit a small number of people. What we're actually trying to do is step out of radicalness.
yeah. And I think having a small group of people in charge is radical, like you say,
Mm,
right? And that one of the big criticisms that many across the political spectrum have of our government and of Parliament is that people don't work together,
mm,
right? And they won't find compromise, or they won't debate properly, and they won't be grown-ups about it, and they pantomime. And under a fairer system, they do have to work together more. They do have to actually come to agreements. They do have to meet in the middle. They do actually have to, come to solutions to problems together as a team. It's what we want,
mm.
right? We don't want them just arguing all day. I don't think anyone wants that. It's not productive, and it's just, you just get bored of it. So I think a fairer system kind of gives us what we want in terms of a collaborative nature to government, but also actually holds them to account as well. They're not so safe. They
Mm.
need to be doing good things for us. Otherwise, we do what people like Rob and Mog would say. It's like, well, they can tell us what they think at the election box. It's like,
Yeah,
well, currently, no, we can't really.
yeah.
But I would love it if we could.
Well,
So they've got this rhetoric of they can use their votes.
yeah. Even if even if people do make their voices heard at the ballot box, though, it doesn't make any fucking difference. Like, last last week, they lost 500 council seats, or 500 councillors. Uh,
They lost the election. That's
yeah,
the headline. They lost the local elections.
and Johnson's response to it was just like, I stood there floor jawed. I was like, his response to it was like, well, we're just gonna carry on deliver. Like, there was no acknowledgement that people were tired with this sort of shady, authoritarian, light,
Mm.
borderline fascist style of government, the sort of Priti Patelism, the arrogance, the incompetence. Absolutely no acknowledgement whatsoever. Just like, yep, well, business as usual. We made it through.
Well, I mean, and it is business as usual because, I mean, frankly, the point is that 60% of the country, roughly, over the last several elections for the last 50 years, doesn't want any of this stuff.
Mm,
Right? They haven't voted for them, so they already know that actually the country doesn't want any of those things. And every now and then we get a chance to actually demonstrate that. And of course, what they're doing is making sure that if that number grows, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect them.
mm,
Things like the elections bill, for example, are making it easier for them to stay in power. So they are making sure that their share of the vote can be shrinking, and they will still keep in power because they know that the
mm.
country is against them. They know they're outnumbered. They know people don't want the things that they're doing.
Yeah, this is
And it's
a
the same in America as well. This isn't just a problem here.
this is a
The,
point.
the Roe versus Wade stuff, for example, right? Most of the country is not on the side of the decision about to be made. But it doesn't matter because the people that are actually making the decision are in safe seats, and they
Mm,
know they can do what they want ultimately.
yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, this is a point that that Femi sometimes, or well, not just sometimes, that he touches on quite a bit, where he says, the majority of the country actually sit like comfortably left leaning. They want progressive policies. They have liberal values. It is just that you have this sort of split of the vote across Labour, Lib Dem, Greens, which I suppose is where the tactical voting piece comes in. And we were just talking about local elections a second ago. Do you think the strength of the Lib Dem wins last week is a sign that tactical voting is actually getting out there? Are we seeing it come to fruition?
So yeah, I think so. Local elections are quite difficult to analyze on that level.
Mm.
But it certainly indicates, I think, that people are willing to vote for whoever has the best chance of winning, right? And that's a partly desperation, right? I'll vote for anyone,
Mm.
just not these guys, And I think the numbers do show that. And obviously the spin was that Labour didn't do very well while they still gained lots of councillors. But actually, because of that kind of footballification, that's the only kind of superficial, shallow way that a lot of the media looks at it, right? It's like, oh yeah, but Labour didn't do that well, did they? It's like, yeah, but we did quite well as people, because we got rid of 500 councillors, and we voted for the candidates we thought that would get rid of them. And I think, obviously, if you mapped that kind of result over a general election, we're in coalition territory quite comfortably.
Yeah.
I personally think that that's the most likely outcome of a general election. I also think it's probably the easiest outcome of a general election as well. I think the Labour Party winning is probably one of the hardest.
Do you think
There's this interesting thing where I think a lot of people who are saying, yeah, but just vote Labour, they're not necessarily Labour fans or fans of Starmer or fans of policies or fans of Corbyn or fans of whoever else might be in the Labour Party. But they're in the right mindset. They're in the right mindset of just vote for the people that are going to beat them. They just need the next bit, which is the tactical bit, which is, yeah, but it might not be the Labour Party where you are.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're on the right track, but here's the superpower. Here's the bit you need. It's just the right name. That's it. Which colour do I put my tick by?
Yeah. I suppose my concern would be, so with tactical voting, clearly that is a good route to eject Tories. It might mean that you then get a Lib Dem in your local, so in the home counties, you see a lot of kind of Tory strongholds will go Lib Dem before they go Labour. I wonder why we don't take that a step further and then start pushing for Labour to form some sort of formalised like pre-election coalition with the Lib Dems, because my fear is, and maybe you can set my mind at ease here, Josh, but my fear is that by remaining two separate parties, entirely separate entities, Labour will go into the general election, and with the absence of the red wall and not winning sufficient numbers in Scotland and the southeast, they will actually not be the largest party at the end of the general election once all the votes are counted. And so, if the Tories just inch it, it will be on them to form a coalition with someone else, and we might see another Conservative Lib Dem coalition government. I would feel, look, I'd take that over a Tory 80-seat majority, but I would rather see a Labour and Lib Dem government, and if them formalising or becoming one party almost, like before the general election, if that cemented it, if that made it a bit more certain, I'd just feel way more comfortable. What's your thoughts?
Man, a lot to unpack in that.
Sorry.
First of all, I have very, very low confidence of the Lib Dems working with the Tories. I think they're both very, very different parties than they were 12 years ago.
Right.
Very different leadership, very different membership makeup now, and quite frankly, a different track record, right? You look at Ed Davey, his signalling is that they wouldn't go near it. But yeah, they might be kingmakers, so it'd be interesting to watch. Should they be one party? I think my real simple answer is, do we have to wait for them to do it? Right? Tactical voting doesn't require their permission or a negotiation with them. We can just work out. It's maths, right? We can work out who's got the best chance, and we can force them. We can force their hand, essentially. Does that mean I wouldn't encourage it? Absolutely would. I would love them to work together, right? But I just don't think we need to risk resting on that as being, the only reason we'd show up. I think we can take it into our own hands, and if we take it into our own hands, they will know that that's what we did.
Do you think they could, Labour could be the largest party after a general election without the red wall and without making inroads in Scotland? Because the SNP feel quite solid up there. So, is it possible, even with tactical voting, for them to inch it?
So there are people that analyse this a lot closer than I do, and I try and pay attention to them, really. My personal feeling is that no, they probably can't win it. Could they be the biggest party potentially? Would they get a majority? I think it's really unlikely.
Yeah.
We're talking a bigger swing than 97, right? And without Scotland. like you say, right? Um, and with potentially fewer people turning up as well, right? As you know, as we've seen, there's the apathy factor. So I mean, yes, it's possible. Of course it is, and anything could happen between now and the next election. Um, but should we basically put all our eggs in that one basket of yes, it's possible? I want to go for the thing that's most probable,
Mm.
right? And the thing that's most probable is that we show up and kind of lock it in by voting for the best candidate in every constituency, rather than just the one that they've chosen for us.
Yeah.
If we actually know based on historic data and local insights who the best candidates are, we vote them in. And none of this is an endorsement of any of these people. Let's make that straight as well, right? This is not saying, we love this party and we love the other party. It's, it's it's a step towards change rather than a giant leap. I wouldn't expect a new coalition government to come in and save the world, right? I would expect them to not be the current guys and at least start to do some things to repair the damage from the last 12 years. I think if we have a coalition and that coalition has been put in there by the people, they're much more likely to listen to what we want. And in a coalition, they're much more likely to have to work together as well. So the Lib Dems and the Green Party, Plaid Cymru and the SNP as well, will be able to legitimately put things on the table that the Labour Party will have to acknowledge and work with. We hope that PR will be one of those things, of course.
Mm. Yeah, like one idea I've been kind of playing with the last week is the need for the Labour Party to get a sort of figurehead in that represents this kind of disillusioned far left segment or faction of the party who really have a big problem with Starmer. And it feels to me like unless they get on top of that, you're just going to continue to see more blogs by Owen Jones and more like Starmer's a Tory and like all. It's just going to fester and become more of a problem. So more division. And I just wonder to what extent you could get. I mean, I don't think it could be Corbyn, but like another figurehead from the far left of the party who sits down with Starmer once a week and conveys their issues and their frustrations. So they've got that line in to him and Rayner to communicate what they need to see and to start building that trust back. But I mentioned it to somebody yesterday and they were like, no, it's it's on him. Starmer has to fix it. I'm like, all right, okay. But I don't know, do you agree? Do you see that happening?
I mean, obviously, as a leader, a lot of things are on him, but politics is a team sport, right? And when you have a team that won't necessarily play well with itself, clearly you need to do something about that. And I think it's not just the two factions. There's probably many factions that don't feel like the Labour Party is going where it should. And again, this is an argument for proportional representation, right? In that, there's lots of speculation that the Labour Party and the Conservatives would probably break up at that point. But what would be really happening there is that people would be able to, vote for people that actually genuinely represent what they want, be it, centrist or left in the Labour Party. There'd be a party that represented them, and they'd have to work together again. So we'd have that better representation, and so it'd be people across the spectrum. In terms of like, should there be like a figurehead? I mean, I don't know who it is right now. We're not really hearing anything from anyone, are we? That doesn't necessarily mean there isn't someone in there trying, trying to have those conversations. I imagine that there are very pragmatic people in the Labour Party, just as frustrated as we are with, how it's all perceived.
Yeah. To some extent, I imagine it's an impossible fucking job being Labour leader because you do have to represent the trade unions. You've got to be a bit working class. You've got to be a bit like social justicey, and these are like those profiles would, if you walked into a pub, they would be completely separate people on different tape, like, so it's
maybe asking
one person to embody all those values or to be able to negotiate them and maneuver around them perfectly is quite an ask. It doesn't surprise me. It's quite difficult, seemingly. Like, so when Corbyn was in power, you had a lot of pushback from the Blairites, and now Starmer's in power, you get a lot of pushback from the Corbynites, and it's I don't envy anyone that's in that top job.
Yeah, I mean, the Conservatives are currently, must be laughing their heads off at this. This is the best situation to be in, isn't it? Where we can't get it together, to even like form a proper opposition, I guess. Yeah, I mean, the other side of it is that it doesn't matter who the leader of the Labour Party is, they're going to get attacked, right? Like
Mm.
you say, it's an impossible job in many ways. But when a lot of people, and again, not an endorsement of Corbyn, but a lot of people were saying, oh, anyone else, it'd be completely different. It's like, have you been paying attention?
Yeah,
Like, it doesn't matter who it is, whether you can't eat a bacon sandwich right, wear a suit the wrong way, went to the wrong protest. Doesn't
yeah,
matter. There'll be something, they'll find something, and they'll attack you for it.
yeah.
So yeah, it is an impossible job.
I imagine being a Tory leader is quite difficult, also, though, because uh, I mean, I imagine if you're a Tory leader, i.e., David Cameron or Boris Johnson, life in general is quite easy for you. But I imagine, like, so if you're put yourself in Boris Johnson's shoes, he probably quite does not like Nicola Sturgeon because she wants to have another referendum and break away independence, and obviously that would break the union. So he's not loving her in that respect. But at the same time, for as long as she's there and strong, Labour are kind of fucked.
Yeah. I mean, that's it, right? As long as there's competition between the rest of us, they're fine, and they can have a smaller and smaller amount of the vote.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of me that actually thinks that Boris Johnson wants Scotland to go,
Mm.
because again, it just increases their majority. And I don't think that he is as patriotic in that sense as he's made out to be. Their motivations are very different. Their motivations are money and power.
Mm.
If it all goes horribly wrong, he's going to retire to the south of France, just like the rest of them. And that says everything about the risk profiles of different people in politics. If you've come through Eton, worked at the Daily Mail, invested in the companies that you've then written policies to support, right, and made loads of money out of politics, you just try more and more risky things, right? And
Mm.
Brexit was one of the riskiest things they did, and they were probably surprised that they won it. But if they hadn't won it, what would it have mattered to them?
Yeah.
Literally nothing, because they're rich. Rich, being rich changes your risk profile. And it means you try riskier things because you have an inherent safety net at that point.
Yeah, and in some ways, when you are that sort of person socioeconomically, even a failure is actually a win. So, like,
Yeah.
let's say for a minute he lost the Brexit referendum. Actually, what that would have yielded for him would have been a fucking book deal and speaking tours about what it would have been like had we won. And, this is like My Lost Britain by Boris Johnson. It would have done book signings and gone to colleges across the US. And so
They do
it's,
well out of hypotheticals, don't they?
yeah. Okay, cool. So we've got sort of 5-10 minutes to go, and I wanted to pick your brains on this story that's I hope I'm allowed to talk about this. It went onto Twitter last night,
Let's see.
quoted by Adam from Byline Times. It was on a Dominic Cummings tweet where he suggested that Boris Johnson had been bunging COVID cash directly to newspapers. We don't know in return for what. We don't know how much money. But if this is true, I mean, I was saying earlier about the last 2 weeks of really, I've never been more aware of the influence of newspapers and how far the rot has set in. But if this is true, we are through the looking glass in terms of the relationship, like the coziness between government and media, right?
Well, I mean, that depends what your bar is. I think for a lot of people, we were through the looking glass decades ago, you
Right.
know, because of course this stuff has probably happened all along the way. So when you find out something, are you surprised? Would it surprise you if this was true? Wouldn't surprise me.
It
I'd just kind of go, well, yeah, of course, that's what they do. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So yes, to some extent, it is what they do, and this isn't necessarily a partisan thing. I think back to the
No.
days of Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair visiting Murdoch on his yacht, trying to love bomb him and get him on side, and ultimately that worked out very well for them indeed, right? And then when Theresa May, for example, came to power, I think one of her first meetings was to usher in Rupert Murdoch through the back door. To talk about messaging and comms. David Cameron, very close relationship with the Murdochs. So it doesn't surprise me that Whitehall or specifically Number 10 have a close relationship with the conduits that can funnel out their messaging. What concerns me, what is actually quite eye-watering about this, is the money, like paying almost a subscription fee for good, I assume it's for good press coverage.
The money flows, right? To give you another example, in America, elections cost billions of dollars,
Yeah.
right? and they go and raise a hell of a lot of money from some very wealthy people. In the Trump government, of course, those wealthy people got back a hell of a lot of money in return. So they invested, and I say invested because that's what it was. They got a return. It was an ROI,
Yeah.
billions, and then got back literally trillions in return. Right, so it is an investment. It's not that they think Donald Trump's going to be great for the country. It's basically that they know they'll get something back for it. It's an investment. So is that happening here? Is the question. And I think clearly it is, and this is the whole problem about money in politics, is that, again, in America, they think of money as being freedom of speech, right? Spending money is freedom of speech. And there's a very good reason for that, because it then gets protected and you can do as much of it as you want, right? Here, party donations are a lot smaller, obviously, but there are mutual interests, aren't there? It shouldn't be possible for you to have shares in a company that is, giving donations to your party, for example, and that's just scratching the surface. I mean, if you look back at the PPE contracts as well, that was a huge amount of money going to a lot of people's friends, right? As we're now kind of discovering, those friends are going to be party donors, no doubt, right? So you could, if you were conspiratorial about it, imagine that we've just had our tax money being given to people that are then going to spend that on the parties, in return. So they're now using our money, to prop up the government or to prop up the party in government, right?
Yeah.
Via basically a method of enriching themselves.
And the terrifying thing about that is that, so you have these sort of checks and balances that are supposed to look over these things, and specifically around the election process, you're supposed to have a standards committee or an electoral commission, perhaps we'll call it, who are supposed to oversee that everything's fair and set limits. And what's happened to the electoral commission in the last,
exactly
4 weeks, was it?
Yeah, I mean, the Conservatives have proven they're amazing at policing themselves, aren't they? And now they're going to extend it to the elections as well.
Yeah.
So I await the report that we'll never see about how our next election goes,
Yeah. And it will be, I will be astounded if, as we approach the next general election, with them disbanding or neutering the electoral commission, that they don't up the bar in terms of how much they can spend on campaigning, knowing that they have much wealthier donors than, let's say, the Labour Party.
Yeah, and again, it's another reason that money shouldn't be in politics at all, right? I mean, there's other proposed ways of funding campaigns and funding parties, but ultimately, what shouldn't be allowed to happen is the richest party win, because that just self-perpetuates. And if your goal is to get richer and richer, then obviously you're going to change the system to make sure that you don't get unelected. I mean, I think politics has just now been seen as another business sector for those people, basically, right? And so, reforms need to be basically, disincentivizing politics as being a revenue stream, because currently it is, and it shouldn't be. I mean, politics is about, not only protecting people, but designing our civilization, designing our next 500 years, giving us opportunity. And it's being completely misused, on purpose. I mean, I think I said this at Byline. We've let the lords into the commons.
Yeah.
They're the landowners. They were previously the slave owners. They run the banks. They decide who royalty is, right? They decide what we get to see, in the media. They are the lords, and they realised that they could get elected if they just spent enough money on it. And rather than having two houses, we've effectively got two houses full of the same people. It's one of the richest cabinets of all time, right?
Yeah.
If you own lots of property, how's that going to affect your policy design when it comes to, housing? I mean, it's a perverse incentive, isn't it? Right? You've got a conflict of interests.
Well, there was that stat that came out when they were voting on like rent caps, I think it was a couple of years ago. It said something ridiculous, like 60 or 70% of the MPs who were voting on it had buy-to-let portfolios.
Yeah, and in America, again, I know I keep making the comparisons, but a lot of people do. People like Tucker Carlson, right? He's a huge landlord. Like he's got hundreds and hundreds of properties, and so of course it's in his interests to prop up politicians that support his wealth. So yeah, I mean, we could have a whole nother conversation about how to better design how decisions are made. But money is the big one, I think.
You mentioned a minute ago about like the parliamentary system is supposed to be there to design society or civilization and where we're headed in the next 100 or 300 years. This podcast is called Aid Thompson and Other Disappointments. So let's try and leave this on a really low note, Josh. Do you have I mean, let's say we fix Brexit and we get a Labour Lib Dem government in, and unicorns and rainbows flying around everywhere. But do you think that the human race is still going to be here in 100 years' time?
So in a technical sense, yes, of course. But in a qualitative sense, what would it be like, right? And I think there's still a lot to play for. I mean, ultimately, we're deciding, Mad Max or Star Trek, aren't we? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, putting the climate stuff to the side for a second, because I think obviously that's the big one. Automation is actually, I think, one of the most important things. And the way that automation will affect our lives goes in one of two really obvious directions, right? It either makes jobs completely irrelevant, but some people still get incredibly rich by selling us stuff, or it makes jobs completely irrelevant. Notice that's the same in both scenarios.
Yeah.
But it enriches everybody's lives as a result, right? So, no one has to work anymore. It's a utopia, right? And that's a really simple decision. It's like, do we let people who have lots of money basically continue to have lots of money for doing nothing, just because they historically had lots of money, built on the backs of lots of people that didn't, or do we say, well, that's not such a good idea, is it? Look where we've ended up. How about if we just let stuff happen on its own, through automation? I'm sure there's an Asimov book about this. And then we're free at that point to pursue art and science and sport and music and, making not only our lives better, but everyone else's. And I think clearly that's the thing that most people would want. And I imagine that people across the political voting spectrum, would much prefer that second outcome given the choice. And I think that's one of the biggest paradoxes we have right now, is that actually, if you unlabel who a policy was written by, there is vast support for progressive policies across the spectrum, right? When it comes to housing or jobs or and you pick a topic, right? When you then say, oh yeah, but this is a Labour policy, people go, oh, actually no, I changed my mind.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay, but let's focus on the policies instead then.
Yeah.
We have a lot more in common than I think people realise.
Yeah, but it goes back to what you were saying before about like the footballification of it. Like, people just don't want to nail their colours to that mast kind of thing,
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I realised about Brexit, and I only realised this very recently, really, I should have realised it a lot earlier, was that a lot of people did vote for Brexit for good reasons. They care about the NHS, right? They do want the NHS to be well funded. That was a genuine thing, They were just lied to about what was going to happen.
Yeah.
But the important thing is that they do care about the NHS. So again, there's that commonality, right, that we have across both the voting, the voting divide for Brexit, and I imagine for parties as well, that we do predominantly care about the same things. We have the same aspirations for our families and our lives. We have the same concerns, as everyone. We just choose to put our cards on one particular table or the other.
Yeah. It's just, well, it's like anything, isn't it? It's like the Roe Wade thing where you said, most Americans actually support women's rights in that respect.
Of course.
It's like build more social housing over here. Most people agree that we need to build more social housing. It's just a case of getting us over that hump, whether it's in Westminster or Washington or wherever. I think if we look at those as the opening chapters of human nature and civilization, then maybe the utopia or dystopia, it's not looking too good, Josh.
I think things are never going to be perfect, right? But if we aim for perfect, and don't even get something that's good.
Yeah.
Small steps.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, Josh. If you want to follow Josh, he's on Twitter. What's your handle on Twitter again? Remind me.
Josh Forwards, Josh FWD.
There we go. Give him a follow. And I'll be back next Wednesday for the solo edition of the podcast, and next Friday night with a guest. Thanks very much, everyone, for jumping on the live stream. And I'll catch you next time. Ciao.